WB Sons in Newcastle held their October Classic car auction last Saturday, and what a catalogue they had. But would it throw up any shock results? Could Fords recover from the previous auction reviews that I've done? And how did the couple of Renault Sport Clios do? Stay tuned to find out. I have to say, what a selection of cars WB Sons had going through this auction. From the usual classic Fords, which we'll run through towards the end of this video, to the rarely seen on the roads these days Volkswagen Polo Coupes. First of all, I want to cover Porsche. There were 4 Porsche cars I noted of interest before the auction. The first was this early 996 Carrera 4 Cabriolet. Now, although C4 cabs are the slowest 996s you can buy, and probably one of the less sought after models, the guide price had a bottom end of 10 grand, which I thought would gather quite a bit of interest. The second was this 968 Club Sport. Now, anything with a Club Sport badge when it comes to Porsche tends to have strong following, and with a guide price of 18 to 22 grand, I didn't expect this car to be any different. The third was this 993 C4 Cabriolet. Now, as everyone knows, 993s have gone absolutely mental over the last few years. You can't touch turbos or RSs these days, and even less sought after cars like this C4 have shot up in price recently. Now, I'm afraid to say none of these cars sold. I'm not necessarily surprised with the first two. Although they had very reasonable guide prices, they're just the type of cars that either sell on the day or they don't. The 993, however, I was very surprised this didn't sell. There's not many in this condition with this history and specification that come on the market, so I thought someone would have taken a stab at it. The fourth Porsche on my list ended up being one of the bargains of the century. This is a late second generation 996 Carrera 2 cab. Now, it's not one of the greatest specs you'll ever see, and it does need a bit of TLC, but it's sold for an amazingly cheap £8,175. Now, bearing in mind the guide price was between 10 and 14 grand, someone has taken home a little winner here. So a bit of a mixed bag for Porsche in this auction. It seems like we still haven't seen the bottom of the curve for the 996 911s, and I'm wondering if the 993 boom has now slowed right down too. Before I move on to the Fords, I just want to quickly run through some of the cars of interest in the auction. There were 2 Renault Sport Clios that were nice to see, the first being this Phase 1 in titanium silver. With only 65,000 miles on the clock and a good history, I thought the guide price of 3.5 to 4.5 grand was on the very reasonable side, so I was really surprised that this didn't sell, even if it was showing a few signs of rust and wear and tear. The second Clio was this Phase 2 version, and this one certainly wasn't showing any signs of wear and tear on the bodywork, which was reflected in its higher guide price of 6 to 7 grand. I did think this was on the higher side, so not really surprised that this didn't sell, although there aren't that many left in this condition to be fair. Now for a controversial one. I know these Mark 4 Golfs are seen as the Puma GTi to have alongside the Mark 3, but because their values hit such a low 10 to 15 years ago, there aren't many left in this condition. This is a one-owner car with just over 50,000 miles on the clock. They look a bit mundane, slow as shit, especially in 2 litre guys, and they can be a nightmare to keep on top of. They're not appearing in the front arches. But I think the estimate on this one was very reasonable, and it actually sold below it at £3,815. Staying with VW for the minute, I certainly wasn't surprised to see this little Polo Coupe sell. I actually thought the estimate of 600 to a grand was on the low side, but the auction house got it spot on because it sold for £940. I genuinely thought this would tip the grand mark, but I suppose taking into account the signs of rust, it's probably a fair price. Now on to Ford. I know that over the last couple of auction reviews that I've produced, I've reported the classic Ford models hadn't performed very well. I'm pleased to report that there was a bit of improvement in this auction. Although there were quite a lot that didn't sell, I'm going to skip the ones that didn't sell and jump onto the ones that did. The first is this 6th generation Escort RS 2000. I have to admit, I keep changing my mind on this one, and I can't decide whether it's sold for a good price or not. On one hand, It's in a sought after colour that I think is called Tour Mallard Green, and with it being four-wheel drive, it's one of only 500 built. It's got modest mileage, have 95,000 on the clock, and it's got a relatively long MOT on it. The downside is that it was a Category N write-off in 2021. Now, for those that don't know, a Category N write-off basically means that the car sustained cosmetic damage only and not structural. So really, it's not necessarily the end of the world for someone who really wants one and doesn't want to pay through the nose. Selling at £4,360, it's below its estimate of 5 to 6 grand, but in the current market, I think it's done well to sell for that, and the new owner should be happy with that price too. The next Ford was a nice relief to the current market conditions. These RS turbos have really struggled recently, having boomed in price over the last few years. They seem to have reached a bit of a ceiling, which has caused a lot of unsold cars at recent auctions. Having only 47,000 miles on the clock and 4 former keepers, I did think the estimate was very reasonable at 14 to 18 grand. I've seen much ropier examples go for more than 14 grand. This one sold for just under 20 grand, so it did really well, as it's certainly not in perfect condition and needs to be recommissioned. Last but certainly not least is this immaculate Puma. With the sought after 1.7 engine, which was co-developed with Yamaha in Japan, low mileage of 54,000 and service history, it's no surprise that this sold. WB Sons got the estimate spot on because it sold at the top end of it at £4,360. If you had said to someone 10 years ago that these would be getting sold for 5 grand, they would never have believed you. But due to the value trends that a lot of classic Fords have gone through, these are now being dragged up too. The racing Pumas went through the roof a few years ago, and I think people have clicked onto the handling and low maintenance costs of the lesser models, the 1.7 being the pick of the bunch. Considering this is now a 25-year-old car, I can't believe how well these have aged, especially in the Panther Black paint. I reckon even at this price point, immaculate condition Pumas like these will continue to rise over the next few years. Finally, I'd like to thank WB & Sons for giving me the permission to produce this video. They've got another auction coming up in December, so check out the website in the link on the description of the video and see what they've got to offer in December. Cheers!